Welcome to this episode of United States of Africa, where we explore a question that has haunted the minds of many Africans for decades. Is Africa still under the control of Western powers? And if so, how do these hidden influences continue to manipulate our collective destiny? Today, we will delve into the subtle and sometimes invisible mechanisms through which these powers continue to exert their dominance over our continent, and why, despite decades of political independence, Africa still seems trapped in a web of foreign influences. Let's start with a troubling but well documented fact: the monetary situation in Francophone Africa. The CFA franc, a currency used by 14 countries in West and Central Africa, is minted in France and controlled by the French treasury. Yes, you heard that right. More than 60 years after independence, this currency is still largely under the control of the former colonial power. This means that the monetary policy of these African countries is essentially dictated by a foreign entity rather than by local economic needs. The CFA franc, which stands for Communauté Financière Africaine in West Africa and Coopération Financière en Afrique Centrale in Central Africa, was created in 1945. At the time, France had just suffered the ravages of World War II and needed to maintain its influence over its colonies to rebuild its economy. The CFA franc was a clever way to retain indirect control over the economies of these territories. But what's even more troubling is that, despite numerous criticisms and movements calling for the abolition of this currency, it remains in place. Why? Because this monetary structure allows France to maintain a disproportionate economic influence in Africa. The foreign exchange reserves of countries using the CFA franc are largely held by the French treasury. This means that these countries must deposit at least 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in a special account at the French treasury, thereby limiting their monetary sovereignty. Another aspect to consider is the control exerted by Western multinationals over Africa's natural resources. Take the example of oil in Angola. Despite being one of the largest oil producers in Africa, a significant portion of the revenue generated by this resource goes directly into the pockets of Western oil companies: ExxonMobil, Chevron, Total Energies. These energy giants have extremely favorable agreements that allow them to control the extraction, production, and distribution of Angolan oil, while leaving a relatively small share of the revenue to the Angolan government. The mining sector in the Democratic Republic of Congo is another striking example. Cobalt, essential for the production of batteries in our cell phones and electric vehicles, is primarily extracted in the DRC. However, the conditions under which this resource is exploited are often dictated by foreign companies, mainly Chinese and Western, who use opaque methods and often resort to abusive contracts. The result? Much of the wealth generated by cobalt does not benefit the Congolese people, but rather foreign interests that continue to pull the strings behind the scenes. Another crucial point we need to examine is the role of international financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. These institutions, often perceived as allies of developing countries, impose conditions that perpetuate economic dependency. For example, structural adjustment programs imposed in the 1980s and 1990s forced many African countries to adopt drastic austerity measures, privatize key industries, and cut public spending in critical areas such as health and education. These policies often exacerbated poverty and undermined the capacity of African states to develop autonomously. And let's not forget the role of Western military bases in Africa. While presented as strategic partnerships for combating terrorism, these bases are often perceived by local populations as a form of military neocolonialism. The United States, for example, has military bases in several African countries, including Djibouti, Niger, and Senegal. These military presences not only protect Western economic interests, but also exert direct political influence over African governments. As a finance professor at a Western university and an advisor to several Western governments, I can tell you that these dynamics are well known in political and economic circles in the West. Discussions about Africa in these circles are not focused on how to genuinely help the continent develop, but rather on how to maintain access to strategic resources and preserve spheres of influence. Another often overlooked fact is how international trade agreements are negotiated. Take, for example, the Economic Partnership Agreements, EPAs, between the European Union and African countries. These agreements, which are supposed to promote trade between Europe and Africa, are often biased in favor of Europe. African products often struggle to access European markets due to strict standards and high tariffs, while European products flood African markets, undermining local production. But perhaps the most striking example of this ongoing interference is the control of digital data. With the rise of technology and the growing importance of data, many Western companies exploit African data without adequate regulation. Google, Facebook, and other tech giants collect enormous amounts of data on African users, data they then use to influence markets, consumer behavior, and even political processes. And all of this happens with the tacit, if not active, complicity of some African governments. What we need to understand here is that the control exerted by these external powers is not always blatant. It manifests through subtle but powerful mechanisms that keep Africa in a position of weakness. As long as these external influences continue to dictate the continent's economic, monetary, and even military policies, Africa will not be able to fully realize its potential. So, what can be done? First, it is crucial that we, Africans, become aware of these dynamics and openly denounce them. It is not enough to talk about independence or sovereignty. We must act to truly obtain them. This means, among other things, that we must demand deep reforms of the monetary system, such as the abolition of the CFA franc and the creation of a truly independent African currency. It also means that we must resist economic programs imposed by foreign institutions and seek African solutions to African challenges. Second, it is essential to strengthen African institutions, not just in terms of power, but in terms of legitimacy and representativeness. African leaders must be accountable not only to their voters, but also to the entire continent. African solidarity must not be an empty slogan, but a political and economic reality. Finally, we must encourage a new generation of African leaders and citizens who understand global issues and are ready to defend the continent's interests. This involves education, innovation, and collaboration among African nations. We must build a strong Pan-African network capable of resisting external pressures and promoting an African agenda for development and prosperity. In conclusion, Western control over Africa is no longer exerted through weapons or direct colonization. It operates through economic, monetary, military, and technological mechanisms that perpetuate a modern form of domination. But by becoming aware of these realities and acting together, we can change the course of history. Africa must rise, not against external enemies, but against the invisible chains that continue to hold it back. Together, we can build a future where Africa is finally free, sovereign, and prosperous. This is a call to action. Join the movement. Together, let's make the United States of Africa not just a dream, but a well thought out, meticulously orchestrated, and sustainably preserved reality. Thank you.